the evening of Monday, May 11th, and I made it down to the farm. And now we're looking at some frost damage. This field actually doesn't seem too bad. It seems like maybe the smaller corn was less affected. Definitely had some at Mom and Dad's that doesn't look too hot in spots. You can see, like this guy, don't look real hot. Everything's pretty yellow because it's been cool and a little bit damp. But definitely knocked some things back. These are not nearly as bad as some of the stuff that I was looking at earlier. I may end up going back and taking some video. I didn't have the camera with me at the time when we were looking at them. But I'm kind of checking the lower spots of the field first, because that would be where you would have the greatest chance for that cold air to pool and cause damage. I don't think it actually got all that cold here. Like normally what I've heard is it takes kind of like 20s to really knock corn back too badly. And I think that it was only like, it was predicted to be 33. It maybe got a couple degrees cooler than that, but I don't think it was below 30. But definitely seems to have caused some damage in spots. And like I said, this actually looks a lot better than where I was an hour or so ago. But I guess at least we've got some that looks decent yet. So I'm kind of got some pink flags and a Sharpie, and where I can sort of see spots where there's quite a few in a row that are knocked back, like where the whole plant looks like that. Kind of doing a stand count between two flags and like writing it on the flag with a marker, and then come back and check that in a week or so and see if things come back or die. The growing point on everything should still be below the ground, so the plant should keep pushing leaves even though the stuff above the ground has gotten frozen and died. But there can be a variety of mitigating factors with that, I think, as far as buggy whipping and causing the corn plant to sort of get knotted up in itself, or the new leaves to get knotted up in the dead foliage. So, always an adventure. Like I said, this field actually doesn't look bad, so that's somewhat encouraging. But definitely that early planted stuff does not look as hot as I would like it to. And that's really kind of frustrating, because we planted into really nice conditions and a really nice warm forecast for quite a while after we planted, that we had things up nice and looking good last week. And now, maybe not so much. So now I'm looking at a different spot in the same field, and there is a little bit of damage right here, kind of right in the bottom of a row of terraces that are fairly steep up and down, and you can see not a lot of bright green left on most of these in this section, and a significant amount of brown. So I just kind of went down the line and tried to count these, the corn that's there, and then wrote that on the flag. There's a spider, a couple spiders. So I can come back to this spot and see how things look after a few days or a week or 2 weeks or whatever. Just to see how things look. I mean, it seems like the small corn is less affected than the earlier planted from what I've looked at so far. It seems like this field looks a lot better than some of the others, even in this section. But kind of the fear is, if we have some that got dinged back in the same row as ones that didn't, or like different plants getting affected to a different extent, you end up with plants that are ahead or behind others. And if you have like late emerging corn within the row, then that sort of acts more like a weed and causes you to lose yield versus not being there, which is kind of some of the concern. So like this would be an example where we have one that's knocked back pretty good, and then a nice green one next to it, and a nice green one on the other side. So that's probably going to come back, but it'll be behind, and then will probably, take up sunlight and nutrients, but not have much of an ear, if any. So, not ideal, but it is what it is, so we'll just have to keep an eye on things and see how it looks here as time goes on and things recover, and decide if there's anything bad enough that we're going to try to do anything about it, or most likely we're just going to live with it. But definitely not what I wanted to see today. I'm in another field now, and I believe this should be the same hybrid as the field that I was just looking at. I'm not 100% sure on that. I'd have to look and see what I planted on that other farm. But definitely some stuff here that don't look too hot. This is kind of the lowest spot of a big chunk of the field. There's quite a bit of water that comes through here, which is why I had rye drilled and why I sort of drove wide to try to keep a little bit of rye in the area where all the water is going to flow until I come back with the Roundup when I spray the whole field. But no bueno. Could be worse, but no bueno. The one upshot is that at least the soybeans were not really up yet. So this would have been, I believe, the second field that I planted, second or third. I think the first soybeans that I planted, that were the 3.0s maybe, are not the most super vigorous. These are the 3.9, I believe, and they're just looking good, but all under dirt and pushing upward. So at least I don't think I had any soybeans that were affected by the frost. I'm now in my first planted field, kind of in a lower spot on the edge of it. A fair chunk of this 40 drains through this spot. And it's probably pretty similar to the stuff at Mom and Dad's, where we have a good number of plants that aren't really affected, or you just have like an outside leaf that seems to be affected so far. But then you have, and there's one that's just coming up, so it was clearly behind. Then you have a couple that look like they went all the way back to ground level, probably. That's the kind of stuff that I don't like to see, because where you have a few that got really dinged, I fear that they're going to come back, they're going to be way behind everything else. Checking out another field now. This would be the last field that I planted, and this would be kind of in the area where I broke the marker, or the marker fell apart. I thought would be a good spot to check, because we have the new terraces, so the ground would have been fairly warm and probably would have had the fastest growth here of anywhere in this field. And I have probably 3 or 4 varieties, I think, between the fence and about here, so within 100 or 200 yards here. We can hopefully get a decent survey of things. And these all look pretty decent, really. I'm not seeing anything that's brown and dead to the ground. Clearly a lot of yellow and not super healthy looking plants, but I think that's just from the cold. But not as affected by the frost, I wouldn't say, as some of those larger plants. So at least I have some stuff that still looks half decent, I guess. Everything that I'm looking at, or all of my corn this year, is within about a 1.5 mile radius of the farm. Maybe 2 miles, but somewhere in that ballpark. And I wouldn't expect there to be a lot of temperature difference between areas, you know, that close together, but maybe there was too, I don't know. This does definitely look significantly better than some of the spots in those first 2 or 3 fields that I planted. And I don't think any of it's a case of knocking it back so far that we're not going to have a crop, but I fear that we took the top end off the yield in some of those spots. And usually the first fields that I plant are the nicest ones with the best dirt and the best tile that normally would be the highest yield potential anyway. But it is what it is. So I decided to bring the camera out, kind of the south edge of the field at Mom and Dad's here, and show you a little bit of what we saw in this particular setting. So if we go down the row here, we've got some pretty decent looking ones, and then some really ugly, decent, kind of ugly, nice, decent, ugly, maybe some that never came up, semi-okay, ugly-ish, good but small, good big. So that's where we maybe have some issues with things not being at the same growth stage. Marked a few spots you can see between the pink flags, and sort of counted the plants in a couple different, hopefully a couple different hybrids, because I think like this flag and those two should be in one variety, and then the stuff up there is in a completely different one. So this one I just marked like 3 that were all pretty ugly, next to the flag here, and then the others where I have the 2 flags I counted on length of row, and then we'll come back and take a look at that. But again, the big problem is that we have a lot of variation. So a lot of plants that look pretty good and some that look kind of like garbage, but that should come back, however, will be behind everything else around it. So in light of kind of what this corn looks like, I think most likely my game plan is going to be to do a little bit of spot spraying, probably tomorrow at this point because it's already 6:30, and probably then head back to central Iowa and drink heavily. I'm just kidding about the drinking heavily, but probably the best thing to do is to not look at the fields for a little while and let them come back and then see how they look next week, most likely. The forecast for the end of this week looks pretty much like garbage, relatively cold and a lot of chances of rain, so I don't think I'm going to be able to do much other than maybe turn some wrenches. And I've put in enough hours this month that I don't really feel like busting myself too hard at the moment. So that's pretty much where we're at. Probably going to do a few odds and ends and then take a few days off and wait for the weather to kind of get warmer and generally better, and then probably get back on doing some of the whole field spraying on the corn.